Hello, my spooky friends, and welcome to Dairyland Frights, the paranormal podcast that covers everything spooky, creepy, and mysterious in the Midwest and beyond. And today, I have another great guest on. I have Will from Red Treehouse. Welcome, Will.
Hey, John. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I've listened to some of your stuff, looked at some of your stuff, and I really love it. You know, it's great that we can scare people as well as maybe illuminate people. You know, I think we both know, yeah, scaring's fine, but sometimes it's nice to kind of get people, take away the mystique of paranormal, right? Like,
Sure.
you know, a lot of skeptics out there, a lot of different people doing, you know, some things that are, you know, they're just trying to get clicks, which I understand. But, you know, some people like us who are trying to scare and have fun and also educate people about the paranormal.
Yeah, for sure. That's a really good way to describe it.
Yeah.
You know, one of my things with the show is I'll tell you the story, you decide for yourself. If we're depending on what we're talking about, there's always going to be two sides, sometimes more than that, right? 3, 4, 50 sides to a story. And each of us is going to come down in our own sort of camp based on a whole bunch of factors. And so for me, I want to tell you the story. I'm going to give you the sides as best I understand them. And then I'm going to let you, after you're done listening, figure out what it is that you believe or don't believe.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the best way. So if you could tell my spooky friends who are not familiar with kind of what you talk about and everything, kind of illuminate my friends. And, you know, I know you kind of mentioned a little bit about there, but you can get a little detail, like what subjects you like to look at or what fun things you like to do.
Yeah, so with the Red Tree House, I cover pretty much any type of spooky paranormal story that could exist. So I run the range of like cryptids, creepypastas, some true crime. Usually those true crime stories have some kind of either supernatural tie-in, allegedly, or some sort of basis in something spooky or other than just the crime itself. Been delving into exorcisms and possessions, hauntings, and classic horror stories. Here recently, I would say in the last maybe 7, 8, 9, 10 months, somewhere in there, have really started to get some pretty terrific listener submission stories, original fiction stories, and that kind of thing. And so really trying to feature them as well. We really run the full gamut of spooky paranormal stuff. So if you love one type of episode over another, there's 200 plus episodes that are out there right now. You can binge it and fall asleep to it if you want, if you can. And if not, yeah, there's so much there. And I feel like there's so many more stories to tell that
Absolutely.
I'm like swimming in, well, when do I tell this story? When do I tell that one? Do I tell it now? Do I tell it later? So, yeah.
Absolutely. Do you have a favorite story so far? Anything that you kind of like, oh man, this is pretty cool?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think my favorite story so far that I've covered is way back in episode 28, the Curse of Christopher Case.
Okay, what's that about?
A young guy in his, he was either in his late 20s, early 30s, who sort of spurned the advances of an older woman who was allegedly a witch. She supposedly put a curse on him, and over the course of several days, he sort of went from brushing it off, no big deal, to like this full-blown paranoia, to they actually found him dead a day after leaving this voicemail on his best friend's answering machine. This was way back I believe it was in the late 80s. And they found him dead. No medical history for why his heart just sort of stopped. And so it's one of those stories that dabbles in true crime because it sort of plays out like a true crime case, but it also dabbles in the mysterious because there was this alleged witch. And then it sort of dabbles in was this witchcraft? Was this health? We don't know. And so I try to cover all those bases to say, hey, this is what it could have been. But I whenever someone asks, what's a good starting point for the show? I always tell them, episode 28. Start there, work your way out of that.
Nice. Yeah, that's interesting. There's been other cases like that. And, you know, I've interviewed witches on my podcast, and they always we kind of get a bad rap. Meaning, you know, there's a lot of good witches out there, and a lot are doing good. Now, this, who knows, right? I've heard other cases similar to this. I don't know what to say. You know, I think that's interesting that someone could have that much power. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure.
And be that, let's be honest, be that petty, you know, like get over it, move on. I mean, just because you said no doesn't mean, your life is,
Right.
over. And we don't know the full story. There's so many other things associated with it. I'm sure. Yeah, those are always great stories, and then you just don't know, right? Was it so much of a witch that it got into people's head or got into his head? Because that happens too, where people just believe over and over and over that they're possessed or they're you know, being cursed or
For sure.
whatever. And one of the things I know, I've never interviewed like a priest who does as an exorcist, but I know people who have and have read about it. And most priests would say that 98% of exorcisms can be handled with themselves and some mental therapy, but there's that 2% where I don't know.
Yeah.
We don't know how to handle that, and that's some great stories, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the more recent episodes, man, I've done so many. I want to say episode 192, 3, somewhere in there. One of the more recent ones covered a story really sort of made famous by a psychiatrist who also like believes in demonic possession, which is unusual, right? Because typically religion and mental health, they tend to be sort of on opposite poles of each other. But in this case, he was a psychiatrist who was called upon by the Catholic Church to verify, like offer the veracity of demonic possession cases. And he tells the story of this one woman, and the story itself is super unsettling. It's really dark, but I couldn't get past like this. Well, is this a demon? Is this really a demon, or is this mental health? Is this physical health? Is this power of suggestion versus actually casting out you see what I'm saying? And so
Yes.
it left me super intrigued, even in telling the story, where I get to that conclusion. I'm like, I've told the story. Now you decide for yourself. I'm walking away thinking, I don't really even know what I think about this. Maybe it's real. Maybe it's not. Maybe I need a snack, and then I'll figure it out.
Yeah, maybe I need a nap or something. Like, yeah, sleep on it.
Yep.
So, what got you into this, Will? I mean, obviously, a lot of people have different stories. What got you into the paranormal?
Yeah. So I feel like in some ways it's as stereotypical and tropish as it could be.
Okay.
I've always believed in the paranormal, and I've always loved spooky stuff, and that's true. That's sort of the cursory answer that I give. But I think to maybe peel back a layer of the onion a little bit. It really sort of started with maybe a faith journey of some sort. Growing up in a Puerto Rican family, faith was maybe not always front and center, but it was influential enough that we often conversed as a family about good and evil, right and wrong, that kind of thing, demons versus angels. And so that was probably where my initial interest was piqued. And so it started there. But then, also growing up in the late 80s and early 90s, that was sort of the boom season for, Twin Peaks and X-Files and Goosebumps and Are You Afraid of the Dark and all these shows, right, that were all of a sudden coming out. And then Stephen King and Dean Koontz. And so there just became a point where media-wise, I was sort of really interested in what horror media was out there. And
Yeah.
then, on a personal level, the men in my family, especially my father and grandfather, they loved to stand out. We grew up in New York City, so we would sit on the stoop, the front stoop, and for hours, I would just be a fly on the wall while they talked about all the scary shit that they dealt with and heard and saw and experienced. I'm like 9 years old. Like, I got to go to bed in 20 minutes. How am I going to get up there? How am I going to make it through the night? But I loved it. I was just hooked, and
Yeah.
so it just sort of that foundation just sort of solidified in those early years.
I love that. I love that because that's something, again, I can attest to that too, is that's something parents were interested in, like talking about ghosts. It was just like you said, your uncles or dad or
Mhm.
whoever, talking about it. And you just kind of like, wow, that's pretty cool. And it wasn't like they told you, right? It wasn't like they told you, oh, don't believe in ghosts and don't,
Right.
that's all a bunch of crap, whatever. You kind of heard that from an early age. And I think that's really interesting. So have you had any experiences to share?
Oh, I've had a few. We currently live in what our family considers to be a haunted house.
Okay.
When I say haunted house, like whenever I say tell someone, "Oh yeah, we think our house is haunted," inevitably 99% of the time I'll get the response, "Well, our house is haunted too." And it's like, okay, so there's always a part of me that feels like I need to like define my terms a little bit. But
Right.
we've experienced things that we can't explain, that don't really have a natural sort of cause to them, that just sort of have left us scratching our heads at some points, and then genuinely fearful in others. And so for us, we say the house is haunted in large part because we just don't know how to rationally explain some of what we've experienced person to person or as a family as a whole. And so, but yeah, so the house we live in is old. The land especially is old. Revolutionary War era. The school at the corner up by where we live is celebrating 235 years of education in that building. 235 years ago was 1790.
Sure.
Sort of, that's sort of where we're at. And we've just it's been weird. So the two most recent, I'll give you the one that was the big one, right? When we moved in 4 years ago, my kids were all excited because for the first time they were each going to have their own room. They were able to spread out, and like, so we let them just pick their room. We actually let them fight over it. Like, you fight over it, whoever wins. It is what it is. And my daughter, who was 13 at the time, she chose the downstairs room, which is the biggest bedroom in the house. And we said, okay, well, just know everybody else is sleeping upstairs. You're going to be alone on the main living. So one day, a couple weeks after we moved in, I come down early. Now, I'm always the last one to bed, always the first one to get up without fail. I lock everything up. I'm the first one to let the dogs out in the morning, make coffee, that kind of thing. So I come down in the morning at about 5:30, and I notice that every single light downstairs is turned on. Living room, foyer, dining room, kitchen, laundry room, bathroom, not just overhead lights, but lamps and night lights are on. So like the whole house is lit up. And I'm like whispering under my breath, these damn kids, like, man, our
Yeah,
electric
yeah,
bill's going to be
yeah.
$1 million. Like, I thought we were going to
Yeah,
get a break.
yeah.
So I'm like, in my head, I'm like, man. So I go one by one, turn off every light, right? Open up the blinds, let the sunlight in, and have some coffee. And at about 7 o'clock, I get my daughter up, and she said, "Dad, something weird happened last night." And I said, "Yeah, one of you guys left all the lights on." And, it must have been weird. She said, "No, Dad, like, we didn't turn the lights on. I didn't turn the lights on." And so now she's got my attention, right? Like, what are you talking about? So she tells me this story from just a few hours before, even a few hours before I came downstairs. 2:15 in the morning, she is in bed, sound asleep, and she hears a knocking on one of her bedroom doors. So her bedroom has two doors that enter and exit. She hears knocking on one door, which is at the bottom of the stairs. But it's like a bang, like someone's banging on the door trying to get in. Freaked out, she gets up, she opens the door. There's no one there. It's pitch black out in the hallway. No one's out there. She closes the door and jumps back in bed. Puts her headphones on because she's trying to like settle herself down. A couple minutes later, she hears that same banging on the other door on the other side of her room.
Mm.
So at this point, she's freaking out, and it stops, and then a few minutes later, it starts again, just bang, like someone's trying to break down the door to get in. She runs over, opens the door. There's no one out there, but all the lights are on. And so she hops back into bed, freaked out, covers on her head, headphones in, and I come down 2 hours later to find all the lights still on. And so I tell her, I said, Nat, her name's Natalie. I said, Nat, why didn't you wake us up? She's like, because I was too scared to leave the room. I didn't know what was out there. And I thought it was one of you guys playing a trick on us. And I said, well, we wouldn't do that. I mean, I like horror, but I'm not gonna. I don't want to pay for
Yeah.
therapy, so I'm not gonna do this to you.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so she just had this experience where she heard this banging, and we every so often we'll hear footsteps upstairs, like someone wearing heavy boots walking around. We have two dogs, and the dogs are usually, I work from home, and the dogs are usually with me where I'm working. And there have been times where they'll pick their head up and look up the stairs, or they'll walk to the staircase and look up and then walk back. And so there's just these weird, unexplained, hard to understand, can't quite rationalize what is going on kind of things that just leave us spooked, really spooked.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. I hear that quite a bit with people who have haunted houses or apartments even. Do you think the spirits are trying to just communicate to you to tell you something, or do you think it's just what they call residual hauntings, where basically it just happens? 3 o'clock every morning, this happens. You could set your watch to it.
So I don't know if it's residual in that. there's never been a real consistent time where we've experienced stuff. So there have been times where my son will walk out of a room and he'll like flinch, like, whoa, like something's there. And he said, Dad, I saw this little boy out of the corner of my eye. He was standing in the corner and then he's gone. Right. And so I think we sort of chalk it up to, I don't know if they're trying to communicate something, but we think there are possibly two types of spirit in the house. One that's this little boy, we call him Henry. He's sort of playful, almost startles us, but doesn't scare us. You know, it's almost like, dude, what are you doing? Like, don't if you're gonna
Yeah,
hang out, don't hang out in a corner and scare us. But then
right.
there's this other thing, and the other thing is more brooding. It's a little darker. It's the thing that we think was banging on my daughter's door. There have been times where I'll be washing dishes in the kitchen and I'll feel a shadow come over me from behind, and it just though that one scares us. My wife has heard something whisper in her ear, like her name in her ear at night. That one scares us. There's never been a time
Yeah,
where we've experienced that where we've thought it was playful, where we always respond in fear to that one. And so
yeah,
Henry happens more often, maybe once twice a month one of us has a Henry sighting, and then the darker one doesn't happen that frequently, but it's definitely more memorable. It sticks with us a whole lot
yeah.
longer,
I
you know.
bet. Yeah. Have you brought in a medium, investigators, paranormal investigators, anything like that to see what's going on?
We haven't, and we've thought about it, but we haven't as of yet. Yeah,
Yeah. That's interesting because I know some people do, some people don't. And that's totally your prerogative of what you want to do. Because again, I think it's, the mediums I interview and stuff, like they always tell me, I'm not there to scare people. I'm not there to make their lives worse or anything. I'm just there to give them information. Like
sure.
there's, they'll tell me like, oh, there's one spirit, it's a little boy, like you said, they're just mischievous. He's,
Hmm.
he just likes to have fun. The other spirit maybe isn't. And, and I've always asked, like, how do you relate to the person in the house that you don't scare them, right? This very sensitive information. And they said that's the hardest part of their job because a
Yeah,
lot of people will be like, well, what do you mean it's evil? What do you mean, And most of the time they're like, you don't bother it, it won't bother you. Or,
sure.
and if it does get to a certain extent where, unfortunately harm is coming to your family, then they find the right people to come in there, and that's not easy either because everyone sees
Yeah,
the
for sure.
movies and like an exorcism, like they just come walking in there, yeah, it's their exorcism. No, you got to go
It's
through a long process
yeah,
and like have this approval and yeah, and that's why most of the times most people will just bless the building, and usually that does the trick. Sometimes it does.
mm.
And then I've heard some very scary stories of, people telling me like there's demons in closets, where there's demons in the
Oh,
basement, where there's that. And I'm like, well, what'd you do? And they're like, only thing we could do is inform them of the situation, inform
sure.
them, here's some people to help. But at the end of the day, you have to decide whether you're going to stay, right? And
Yeah,
determine
for sure.
determine what you're going to
And,
say.
and I think for us that's been the thing, is that it happens so infrequently, and it always
Yeah,
catches us by surprise. It's never a thing where
right.
we're expecting it, right? And so it's almost like, all right, well, so like my boys will see Henry, in a corner as they're turning into a room, and it's like, Dad, what do we do? And it's like, nothing.
Yeah,
I don't think you can do anything, but like, just you know, don't be super afraid. I mean, I know it's startling, but don't give it
yeah,
don't give it energy, that kind of thing. And you know, so it's been a few months. I want to say
yeah. Okay, good.
maybe 4 or 5 months since we've seen anything. And the last time I saw something was definitely that darker presence, which that one I think scared me more than the story my daughter told me. That
Mhm.
one's the most recent one I had, definitely scared me for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And to exactly your point, I've interviewed people who lived in haunted houses, and they say the same thing you do. It doesn't. They think like, again, if you watch too many movies, like every day there's something. They're like, no, it'll go months without anything.
Yeah.
Or sometimes it'll be a little bit worse some days, and some days it'll just be playful.
Yeah.
And they just kind of just dealt with it, for lack of a better word, of which I think would be
Day
very
to day, you're
difficult.
just going on.
Yeah, because you can't live in fear, but then also you're like, "Oh boy, how am I gonna start my day?" Right?
Right.
Like, is it,
Right.
and I can see how that could be nervous for some people. Do you notice any increased activity when there's electrical storms out, meaning thunderstorms, or maybe like it's a really cold, blustery day? Do you notice any increased activity with that?
So I don't think I've ever actually paid attention to it. And honestly, I probably couldn't tell you one way or the other,
Okay.
just because it's something I've never really given thought to. I
Yeah.
know that so if I had to like pull a pattern from it all, I would say that we tend to experience things in the colder months between, let's say, November and February. So the scariest incidences that I've had have been in the winter months. But I don't know that there's any specific like date on the calendar or any sort of specific weather activity that's going on that sort of, you know.
Yeah. And that's really interesting to me because I would love for someone to do a study. Like, because maybe there's an anniversary, that something happened in your house. Maybe there's something,
Sure.
who knows? And I just think that's really interesting for people to kind of look at that and go, I wonder if we should, consider that. Yeah, that's really interesting. I love that. Again, I think it makes you appreciate your house, but also like, if you're in the paranormal, kind of understand it, right? If you weren't,
Yeah.
you'd be like, I'm out of here. I am
Well,
gone.
there's something I didn't tell you, and that's that we found a small graveyard about 75 feet off the side of the house. So one day I don't even remember what I was looking for, but anyway, I managed to find just a Google Maps image of our house, of our property. And I noticed that there was a cemetery marker in the field next to our house. Now that field is not on our property, at least it isn't right now. And I was looking at it, I was like, there's no headstones out there. There's no grave markers out there. It's just a flat field that cows roam on and they graze and that's it. Well, that night we got home and I took my boys and a flashlight and said, "Hey, we're gonna go find a cemetery, guys." And they were like, "What?" And so I showed them the map and the
Dad, you're
headstone marker. And
crazy.
sure enough, we jumped the fence and no more than 10 or 12 feet over the fence line. So 50 feet from our house, 10 to 12 feet over the fence line, there are 3 grave markers, flat markers in the ground itself. Now, 2 out of the 3 are really difficult to read, almost impossible. They've been, weather worn and rubbed away, that kind of thing. But one of them is what we believe is a child who was about 8 years old, 9 years old when he or she died. We can't make out a name, just the birth date, the birth year and the death year. And so, could it be Henry? Maybe. Could it be nothing? I don't
Right.
know.
Yeah.
But we did discover that about a year ago now.
Wow, that's really interesting. I've heard about things like that too, where people find certain things or
Mhm.
objects, whether
Object,
they're
yep.
cleaning out their garage or something or their basement and they find old dresses or
Yeah.
antiques or something. And they're like, okay, some throw it out and then wish they didn't. And then
Yep.
some just don't do anything with it. They just leave it. And then, again, who knows? Maybe something's attached to
Sure.
it, maybe something isn't. I think that's really interesting because, again, like I said, that to me is like there's different theories out there called stone tape theory, where basically it's about objects that can absorb energies, negative or positive. So it can be a number of different things. It can be someone's antiques, it can be someone's desk, it could be clothes, it could be, who knows? Again, it's hard to nail that down, but it's a fascinating theory because a lot of that is found when my paranormal investigators have talked to me about going in different asylums, houses, wherever they've gone, abandoned hospitals. And, some, unfortunately, didn't think it through, but they brought something back with them and they wish they did because it's usually something bad that happens. And I think that's fascinating to me. Like there's energy associated with it, and you move it and move that into your house, it could cause problems.
Sounds like a worst case scenario nightmare kind of thing.
Hmm.
Can't
Yeah.
think of anything worse than that.
Yeah. So again, I always tell people on the show, if you're somewhere and you're doing investigating, just leave it. Even if it looks cool. Oh, I found this. I don't know.
Don't
Book,
take it with you guys.
journal, just leave it. Leave it. Don't get into it. So thank you, Will, because that was fascinating. I love that. So let's get to our topic. What do you think?
Okay. Yeah, let's do it.
So I have an urban legend, or this could be true. Okay.
Okay.
And when I kind of tell you this, it's going to sound like slightly pornographic, but it isn't.
Okay.
You'll go like, wait a minute, what topic are we doing here? This is a paranormal show, John. This is really weird. So today's topic is called Mel's Hole. So again, that's where people are like, man, what are you guys talking about? So I don't know if you've heard about this, but according to urban legend, a bottomless pit near Ellensburg, Washington, claims to have basically, how do you say, kind of a dimension to different places within the planets, maybe different vortexes, maybe whatever. So I don't know. Have you heard of this before?
No, I haven't.
Okay,
But I'm fascinated.
this is really interesting. So in 1990, I don't know if you're familiar with the show Coast to Coast AM.
No.
So Coast to Coast AM, if you were like, I worked third shift. I did it for just back in the day in the 90s, was an AM radio, and it was on from like 11 at night to like 3 or 4 in the morning. And you just call in and you would just tell your spooky stories or tell, whatever you would do it. And a lot of it was, to be honest with you, I don't want to say crackpots. That's not really a nice thing to say, but a lot of people like making up stuff like, oh, aliens have been abducting my families for years. Maybe they have, maybe they haven't. I don't know. But, some of the people were like, yeah, okay. But it was still a great show because everyone who called in had really interesting things. And the majority of the show was people just calling in to say, my house is haunted. What do I do? These are my spooky stories, so on and so forth. In 1997, a guest calling himself Mel Waters called in and claimed that he had basically a hole on his property, a bottomless hole, he claims. And he said that it was on his rural property in Elsenburg in Catius County, Washington. And according to him, it contained different mysteries. He said it was an unknown depth. So this guy was kind of I would say a farmer, maybe. He kind of had like his own property in the middle of nowhere. But he had claimed to have measured its depth using fishing line and a weight. Although he says he got to 80,000 feet, didn't touch. Yeah, 80,000 feet. That's 24,000 miles, according to him.
That's insane.
And this was in his, and let me clarify, Will, and my spooky verse, this was just his, not his backyard, but kind of like in a field, which was just why? I have no idea. But when we go through it, I'll ask you at the end whether you believe it or not. But he also claimed that his neighbor's dead dog had been seen alive sometime after, this is terrible, someone threw it in the hole. So someone threw their neighbor's dead dog in this hole. And according to Waters, this dog basically came back as a ghost. Or he said it could have been real, but it wasn't the dog, if you know what I mean. It was the dog, but it wasn't the dog. So, okay.
Interesting.
He claimed that it had magical properties. Okay. And this is, and I'll get into a little bit more depth and everything, but what was funny about this was U.S. federal agents came out there, actual U.S. agents, to investigate it. And they eventually, not to give anything away, but they eventually came out and they had to seize the land.
Wow.
And this is where it gets a little bit weird, okay? So let's back up here and talk a little bit about Mel Walters, okay? And chime in anytime you want if you have any questions or you just want to just make a comment. So Walters made guest appearances, like I said, on Coast to Coast AM. It started in 1997. But he also called back in 2000 and 2002. And you can listen to this. I go to Coast to Coast AM. Now it is a podcast, or it became a podcast. And you can listen to this, okay? And it's just super bizarre. So they've rebroadcast it and everything. Really, most people described it as a modern rural myth. The exact, which is really interesting, of the hole was unspecified. Okay. But basically it was on his property, So I'm like, people don't really want to tell you where it is. But it's, it's on private property. So you can't be like, fortunately going in there and taking a look. Yet several people claim to have seen it. So this was not just Mel calling in. He said several people said, yep, I've seen it. I know what it is. So one of the people that called in or kind of verified the story, his name was Gerald Osborne, but he was a intertribal medicine man, also known as Red Elk. And he told reporters years later in 2012, he visited the hole many times since, and this hole has been around a long time. He claimed since 1961, and he claimed the U.S. government maintained a top secret base near this hole where they believe alien activity happened. So again, it's been around for a while and everything like that. According to, Red Elk, Gerald Osborne, and most people, including him, claimed it had something to do with aliens, maybe a tunnel down to the aliens. But I'm like, wow, that's deep, right? 24,000 miles,
sure.
and you even get to, I'm not really sure about those stats, but that's what he's saying. That's what they're saying. And that's a long, long, long way down. So one of the things during his first call, Mel Waters, he would say that his dogs were terrified of the hole and refused to go near it. So, they would get near it, and really any animal would be very, very,
Sure.
After and again, I thought this was really funny. Well, so, he discovered this just by accident. You know what I mean? He was out about, this is what he claims, he's out and about. Oh, what's this? And then, his dogs would get near there. He'd get near there and he'd just be like, no, I'm not going to, this is bad. There's something wrong. And, it could have been a sinkhole, could be whatever, right? So you don't know. You don't want to sit there and fall in this hole and God knows what's at the bottom. But he finally became curious, Will, and who wouldn't be, right? So, like I said, he decided to see how deep the hole was and measured its depth, like I said, with a fishing line. And he still didn't reach bottom. And like I said, he just kept letting 80,000 feet of his fishing. That's a lot of fishing line, by the way. I don't know where he's going to get 80,000 feet of fishing line, but okay. He still couldn't reach the bottom. Now, like I said, subsequent appearances on the show on February 24th, 1997, 2000 and 2002, Mel made even stranger claims. For a start, he said the hole had pet cemetery power. So getting back to, like I said, someone the neighbor threw their dead dog in the hole. Why? I don't know. And the dead dog basically came to life, and Mel saw it wandering the woods shortly afterwards. While the dog didn't seem to recognize its owner, the deceased owner, I guess, it was when they caught it, or eventually someone must have just said, I'm going to go out there. It doesn't say who, but they had the deceased dog's collar. So I don't know what to say about that. They catch this dog wandering the woods, and then it has that collar. It's really interesting to me. Stranger still, Mel reckoned the hole had a transformative effect on some object. Metals would change into other metals in the hole's vicinities, and radios would put out strange voices and play music from time goes by. So he would put his radio there, and then the radio would go back to, like, let's say it's the 90s music. Now it would go back to, like, I don't know, 1920s music. And, I kind of thought about that, and I kind of want you to know about, your opinion on this. Well, if that's true and he heard that, it's really, really hard to find a station that's playing like niche music. So I don't know. I mean, that to me was really interesting. What do you think about that?
I have so many questions.
Okay.
I mean, what was the size of the hole? Is it it was obviously wide enough for him to let down fishing line relatively easily, assuming
Yeah.
there's something weighted at the end, right? And the hole would be big enough to, for that weight to pass through. Oh man,
I know, right?
wouldn't wouldn't there be? I'm not a geologist in any sense,
Right.
right?
Neither
But
am I.
I have like questions about, the Earth's crust and the mantle and the heat and
Right.
gases that would be
Right.
escaping from an allegedly bottomless pit.
Absolutely. That's a great question.
So it sounds so like if I were doing this and John, you should know, I plan on like doing a deep dive on this thing so that I can do it on the show,
Excellent.
so I can cover it on the Red Tree House. But I would want to know all those things because it my initial gut reaction is a really good urban legend, right? But then there are also questions about like Mel Waters himself. Is he a real person?
Hmm.
Was his, if his land was seized, right? If federal agents came to his land and his land was seized, what happened to him? All these things. So I
And we'll
think
get into that.
okay. So there are answers to those questions. So I think I initially lean urban legend, but there's enough believer in me that's like, but supernatural paranormal stuff is outside the realm of rational explanation.
Right.
Is it
Right.
possible there's this small hole that goes to the nowhere, a bottomless pit? Is it possible? Sure.
Yeah.
Is some of this
Yeah.
hype? Probably.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I have so many questions.
But yeah. So there's some other things too. For whatever reason, they lowered a bucket of ice, lowered into the hole. It came back warm, but it was still solid. And also, Mel
Whoa.
claims it was flammable. Now, why he set it on fire, I have no idea. Now, your question about how big the hole is, Mel also stated that the gigantic hole, okay, and I don't know what that means, gigantic. Again, there's no, if you do a deeper dive on this, maybe you could find dimensions, but good luck. He stated the gigantic hole produced no echoes and that no matter of size of the object thrown in, no sound of it hitting the bottom could be heard. Okay. And then this is really interesting to me. As the years went by, those claims only became more unhinged. So this is kind of interesting. This is kind of like, all right. And like I said, you can listen to it, Coast to Coast AM. And I'm sure there's other places you can find it. This is a topic that I wanted to do for a while because I found it so interesting. But in his 2000 call, Mel told listeners that the federal government, like I said, had seized his land and banned him from visiting the hole again and paid him off. Now, here's the other thing. Mel took the money and he said he was moving to Australia. I don't know. I
Wait,
can't tell you that,
so the
Will.
so the
That's pretty
government
weird,
came.
right? Yeah.
It is. They came. They seized his land. They paid him off, but they didn't have him sign an NDA or
Right.
basically ban him from going on
Right.
record with this stuff, right?
Right.
And then
Right.
he just decided to move to Australia, which seems
Yeah.
a little convenient for the story.
Yeah. Yeah. And
But
it gets even better. So
God,
Mel called back in 2002 and he told the station, Coast to Coast AM, that he had returned from Australia only to be kidnapped by the government. He claimed he had woken up in San Francisco weeks after arriving in the USA with marks on his arms, missing teeth, and memory lapses. Mel's final claim was that he also found a similar hole in Nevada with equivalent properties.
no
Now,
way. So he found a second one.
yeah. Now, this is really interesting to me. In 2002, Jared Osborne, basically the Red Hawk and everything like that, medicine man, he took a group of 30 people and they undertook an expedition to find the hole, but were unable to locate it. And remember, he claims he had seen the hole and he knew where it was. So 30 people and him went to try to find it. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. Local news reporters who investigated the claims found no public records of a man or anyone named Mel Waters ever residing in or owning property in Catayas County. And according to the State Department of Natural Resources, geologist Jack Powell, so we have a geologist here, the hole does not exist and is geologically impossible. A quote, a hole of that depth he claimed would collapse into itself under the tremendous pressure and heat from the surrounding strata, said Powell. Powell said an ordinary mine shaft on private property was probably the inspiration for these stories, and commented that Mel's Hole established itself based on no evidence at all with geology, basically. And that, again, also they had another geologist, his name was Pat Pringle, doubted Waters' story about having lowered 80,000 feet or 1,000 miles of fishing line into a hole, saying that the heat of the earth would have snapped it before it could even reach such a depth. So Mr. Pringle said the more likely explanation was, again, is an old mine shaft in the area that inspired the tales. And sure enough, the region was once home to several gold mines and several shafts that have been perhaps inspired. Now, here's where it gets a little in other stories. When you listen to this a little bit more, he claims that aliens were coming out. He claims that, he would see different creatures coming out of this hole that scared him, creatures like different cryptids, so on and so forth. But if you go and look at some of the records, the government is just, we don't know anything about this. But there is some evidence when you do a little deeper dive into it, which, again, I didn't have the time to, and maybe when you choose to do this, Will, that the government did visit there. There is some proof that they have visited there. And the government basically, like the government always does, nope, there's no hole, there's no nothing. Sure. But again, the witnesses, this is where it gets so murky. Yes, there were witnesses, but none have really said, well, yeah, it's this, it's that. But they know it was there, and they know like that. And here's some of the other claims I thought were really interesting. So I already told you about the dog, but now there were and the aliens coming out of there. Mel said a sheep dropped into the hole, healed his cancer. And like I said, transforming metals all were scientifically impossible, like I said. Again, there's some weird evidence with that again, the government knew something about this, that maybe this was a portal to something. And there has been other holes, or if you want to say, that are similar to this. So, again, it's really, really fascinated. Like, his cancer got cured. Okay. He was kidnapped. But here's one of the things, kind of, wrapping this story up. Again, once you go through this. So many question why the call stopped after 2002. But that should be clear. By disappearing after pointing the finger at the government, Mel ensured his story would live on forever in the world of strange conspiracy theories. No matter how much one tries to debunk Mel's Hole, people still do go looking for it. So yes, the people still go in that area, still looking for it. I want to tell you about similar holes to this. So in Russia, and I'm going to totally screw this up, mispronounce it, but Kola super deep borehole, that one is 12,262 meters or 40,230 feet. That's in Siberia. Dug this hole. There's also a hole in South America that they dug too. They both dug those holes for geological purposes to study the earth. And of course, the people say, well, there's something else going on. But they asked some local people in the area about it. And they basically said that, this was a fairly recent article. So it was like about 4 or 5 years ago. And basically, if you go to this town, like I said, in Catajas County in Washington, people do still talk about it. And you will find people who believe it, but most of the people kind of give you an eye roll and, explain something else. But that's really interesting to me, Will, because there's so many different things associated with this.
Yeah.
That there were witnesses, that, yes, the government was involved somehow. They don't really say what they're involved with, and that some of the claims, even though outlandish, is kind of like I could, and again, chime in here. I kind of get if you're saying aliens are popping out of there and the metals are turning in. He claims the metals were turning into things that scientists would study, get in a lab, and they're like, I don't know what this is. This is some type of metal we've never seen. I don't know about throwing a sheep in, curing his cancer. I don't really get that. And the abduction and the kidnapping is interesting.
Mm-hmm.
But again, so what do you think about this? Kind of mentioned you think it's more of an urban legend, but it's interesting, right? That someone would come up with this.
It is. I mean, it's sort of. I guess I could see how it would evolve as an urban legend, though, right? I mean,
yeah.
If it's a mining town and there are these, now closed up mines, but the entrances are still there. Even as a kid, I would be, I grew up in New York City, so it's different than if I grew up in the rural Midwest. But I could almost envision myself like either creating a story or latching onto a story that already exists about this place, right? And it reminds me sort of like a game of telephone, right? You have this group of people and you start out at the beginning with a message, and by the time it gets back around, 30 people have butchered that message into something unrecognizable. I could almost see how a story about like a magical mine would turn into this bottomless pit to maybe a portal to hell, maybe a cure for cancer, maybe a thing that has metaphysical properties that transforms metal from one thing to the next. But like, when you mentioned the dog coming back as a ghost, Pet Cemetery definitely came into my mind. But Pet Cemetery is based on W. Jacobs' like classic story, The Monkey's Paw from the 1800s, and the story is essentially that, right? That he's got this monkey's paw that gives him wishes and all these things, and so it's almost like maybe bits and pieces of the best stories and legends he's heard, maybe from horror, maybe from written print, that kind of thing, sort of combined into one. Really, I'm fascinated though. If there's no record of Mel Waters ever having lived or owned property in that part of Kansas,
Washington.
well then Washington. Yeah. Where then did the government go? Who did they meet with when they seized his land and visited his property? Like,
that's what I'm saying.
Is Mel Waters a pseudonym? Is it I don't even know. Like, I'm super fascinated.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to me because there's been numerous theories around the world about places like this. Also, Hollow Earth is a theory where, there are different aliens, different races inside our Earth, which is fascinating too. It's kind of interesting. But here's the thing where I always say, he didn't make any money off of this. Didn't make a dime.
That's true.
And he didn't like sell tickets to it, right?
That's true.
There's nothing in here that I found, maybe you'll find, that he's like, hey, everybody, come on to my $50 per person, come out here. So my point is, why are you doing this? Just because you're bored? I mean, this is like, if you're really bored and you're doing this, or maybe you're a little delusional in doing this, okay, but it's, I don't know. It's just, to me, is really interesting. So before we wrap up here, Will, what do you think? Do you think there's some truth to this, or do you think it's just a plain old urban legend?
I would say there's a true story that then inspired the urban legend. That's sort of where I would come down. There probably is a hole in the middle of a field somewhere in Washington, on or near this maybe imaginary person's property, that just went from an obscure hole in the ground to this magnificent, legendary, miraculous alien thing. So I would say if I were doing this episode on the Red Tree House, I would say similar to what you said. This guy made no money from this. There's really no motive, financial or otherwise, for him to have made up this story. And so that may lend credibility to his claims because there's nothing in it for him. But then I would say that's the beauty of the supernatural. We can say this is not possible, not physically, geologically possible, but what if it is, right? What if that little sliver of
Mhm.
uncertainty is enough of a window for this whole thing to crawl into and say, well, there's this big ass hole that's 80,000 feet deep that will,
At least.
it is what it is, at least. Yeah, at least that we know of. Also, 80,000 feet of fishing line is, you could say he's given up more than he's gained because that's a ton of money spent on fishing line.
Exactly. That's a lot. That's a
So
lot, right?
So I would say undecided, John. I think I would be
Okay.
undecided, leaning towards a true story that inspired an urban legend. That's sort of where I
Yeah.
would come down.
Yeah. Yeah. I kind of agree with you that I think there's always some truth to an urban legend,
For sure. For sure.
meaning like some people saw it, some people believe it, right? And it's been passed down through the years. And this is fairly 1997 was not a long time ago,
No,
and
it
calling in
wasn't.
2000, 2002. When you listen, if you get a chance to listen to him, uh he's talking very seriously, and they're asking him questions back and forth. So to me, I think there's something with this. Maybe not to the point where he's thinking, but like you
Sure.
said, maybe there's a little truth to it. That there is something. Maybe there's a mine shaft that just keeps growing and growing and growing. And he just, I don't know, just imagination
Yeah.
took over, whatever. I don't know. But also, like, there are stories where people have talked about aliens. Oh yeah, that didn't, and then, oh, that's true. I didn't know
Mm.
that's true.
It's
Where the
true.
government did a lot of covering up of Area 51, some other bases, and some other pictures and things of that nature of UFOs, and then, oh, here it is. And we're like, oh, okay. So there's a
Yeah, for
little
sure.
sliver of that. So
For
I'm
sure.
really interested in that. I just thought it was a really interesting topic because I was like, hmm,
I'm
it's
super
kind of,
fascinated to know more.
yeah, yeah. And there's so much more to get into. Like I said, you can do your own show on this and talk about some other things, which, like I said, aliens coming out of it, seeing alien activity near it, seeing the government experimenting near it. There's a whole things that were said to it. So
It's
again,
wild.
thank you, Will, for joining me. This was awesome. I hope you enjoyed yourself because I thought
Yeah,
this
for
was a
sure.
fun topic.
Always.
Yeah, yeah. And so before we wrap up today, you want to tell my spooky friends what you got coming up, some topics, and where they can find you.
Yeah, so you can find the Red Tree House wherever you stream pods. Spotify, Apple Pods tend to be the biggest two. The show is on YouTube as well. I am working on the possibility of doing some actual live readings of or narrations of stories, but I've got to get over my fear of looking into the camera as I read. For now, what you get on YouTube is basically just a still image with me narrating the story or the topic, similar to listening on Spotify in that sense. But we just crossed the 200 episode mark, the 2 year mark,
Love it.
and I'm super excited for really just the next wave of stories. So between this past week and October 15th is Hispanic Heritage Month. So being Puerto Rican, I'm just doing a full month's worth of stories and topics that celebrate Hispanic culture from the Spanish speaking world, that kind of thing. So this coming week, I'm actually doing one episode on a collection of classic horror stories from Spanish speaking authors translated, which is a whole work in and of itself. And then I'm also doing an episode on Oso Blanco, which is the most infamous and most haunted prison in Puerto Rico. So
Mhm.
former prison. It's actually they tore it down 10 years ago or so. But yeah, so
I
be sure to
love it.
follow on social
I
media
love
on
it.
Instagram.
I love different cultures, and the Hispanic culture, and it has some great scary things, scary
Yeah,
ghosts
for
and
sure.
curses and buildings and
For sure.
history. Yeah, that's love. I'll definitely check that out. And once this episode comes out, I'll make sure that all the links and stuff go so you can listen
Awesome.
to Will and listen to his shows and celebrate over 200 episodes and Hispanic Heritage Month. please take a part of that, because I think one of the things too is understand different paranormal from different cultures, how they view it
Sure.
versus maybe an American culture or a European culture or whatever culture you're part of. I just love
Sure.
it. I just love the different cultures and how they view it a little bit differently than we do it. So it's awesome.
For sure.
So thank you so much, Will. Again, if you ever want to have me on the show or ask me any questions, please do. I always offer that to people, because I just love partnering with people and sharing spooky stories.
John, it's been a ton of fun. I really appreciate you and the
All
opportunity.
right. All right. Well, thank you, and stay spooky.
You too.